In this demonstration we'll be looking at taking a particular form that has currently been mapped for filing. It contains a range of events and an attribute set, and we would like to assign exactly the same values to all the other forms that match the same filing and event structure. So in this case we choose a form that is suitable with all the correct mappings. We make sure we're in edit mode. We select file and duplicate. It indicates that it's going to duplicate all the settings, including the details page, the events page and the attributes page. Of course you can choose just to do the details page and the attributes and leave the events page off if you find that the events that are currently assigned to the EFT refund are not applicable. But in this case the settings are pretty well 99% of what I need to map to all my notice of assessment forms. So I will select all the appropriate notice of assessment forms, and I will actually even include forms that do not require some of the events, because it's easier to remove than to map them all back again. So I'm going to select the notice of assessment file only, and I'm just going to use the Windows Shift key and select the last entry by clicking once, which highlights all of those objects. So once I've selected the forms that I think is appropriate, I'm going to allow to copy all the settings across. So if I choose the word OK, it's just going to warn me that it's going to update all of those forms with those updates of events, details and attributes. So what I've basically done now is for every one of those forms, I've now been given the opportunity to automatically carry those settings, including the events and the attribute values. Now in the case of, for example, a notice of assessment file only, we actually don't update Tax Manager, so it's easy just to remove that event. However, we might want to keep those other two events because we may have BPA letters when we're just filing documents, or in a lot of the cases you may choose that you don't need those events because you don't create letters when you're just filing a notice of assessment that has no tax implications. So you might just want to remove those two events by using the remove function. The next thing is we'll look at the notice of assessment nil, and you can see if you click the details, click the events, if your screen doesn't refresh, there is a trick. You just need to click custom and then back to events and the screen refreshes. It's just a little bug in how the screen refreshes. So what we're going to look at in particular here is that the tax assessment event for a notice of assessment nil, you can see that certain indexes are not mapped. That was because they were carried over from the previous settings. It also won't map index fields that are not applicable. In other words, the index field doesn't actually exist in Kofax, but it exists in tax. So, for example, a nil, there may not be a payable field. So the rule is here is if you've copied and duplicated your tax assessment events across to all your notice of assessments, you should just double check the blank entries and make sure that you still want those index fields to be mapped. So you can see I've got actual payable and I don't actually see a field in here called actual payable, which makes sense for a nil. The refund field is mapped, the assessed label L. Let's just check if this document contains that index field, and you can see it does have a payable. So you could map that index field back. There's other amounts payable. Once again, depending on your preference, you may choose not to map the index field's other amount payable or refund. You may not choose to map your PAYG or general interest charge. That's all depending on your accountants and the methodology that they use for updating Tax Manager. If they feel that those values are no value to the business, then you could disable or not map those index fields. So the rule is, if you do a duplicate function and it's to do with the tax, and they do contain the tax assessment event, then you should just cycle through each one of those and make sure that the event for the tax assessment update is mapped correctly for you in case it has missed out on any of the mandatory fields. Here's a tip in regards to mapping your notice of assessments and or your statement of account batch class. If you're going to duplicate your notice of assessments or statement of accounts and their events, and in particular we're talking about the tax assessment update event, then the tip would be to duplicate the form called NOA SOA payable, because with that particular form every index field is actually available to the assessment notice of assessment statement of account. So your actual payable fields, your assessed payable and refunds, your date payable and date issue, they're all index fields that actually exist when it comes to a notice of assessment that has a statement of account that is a payable. So if you decide to use your duplicate function, then my suggestion is duplicate your NOA SOA payable. That way when the mappings go across, you'll have every index field that's available to you, and they'll automatically update appropriately for the type of form that you're using.